What's a good old West story if it doesn't have some bank robbers, some revenge, and maybe some witches and demons? Welcome to the depths. Hello, welcome to Reading from the Depths. My name is Lecton. Thank you for spending some time with me today. So today I have a review of a trilogy of novellas, and they are all interconnected and work together. So the first one is called Noose. This one was published in 2022. The second is Demon of Devil's Cavern. This was published in April of 2024. And the last one is Where the Daybreak Ends, Stories from Buzzard's Edge. And this is being published in December of 2024. And I received complimentary copy of all three from the publisher in exchange for an honest review. These were all written by Brennan LaFaro. And I thought these were a lot of fun. These are all horror westerns, and to some extent, they don't really fly outside of their lane too much. They are a comfortable addition to the horror western genre, but I had a great time with all of them. The first one, Noose, we meet Rory. He's our main character that we're going to follow, and we meet him as a young boy. And as a young child, both of his parents are murdered by an outlaw named Noose Holcomb. And the story then jumps to when he's a young adult, and Noose and his gang come back to town, and Rory seeks out for revenge. And so it's a very simple revenge story, but it has a good number of supernatural elements mixed on the ends. And it's very bloody, it's very gory, and it starts with a high octane action scene, and the action scenes don't let up. It's continual back to back action scene. There's really no chance to take a break or catch your breath. And I thought it was a fun story. I thought that the overall arc was kind of expected, but that is okay. That's what we come for in a revenge story of the Old West. I do think it needed a little bit more world building and a little bit more character building. I think everything just felt rushed, And so while I had fun with it because I knew the archetype of late 19th century, early 20th century Old Western town. I knew the archetypes that were being played with. And so it just felt comfortable, but nothing felt very new or fresh. Even obviously mixing in supernatural elements isn't that uncommon in Westerns and in horror Westerns these days. So in that regard, it didn't thrill me, but I had a fun time with it. And I thought that it was written really well, the dialogue was written well, and the main character was written well, if not thoroughly fleshed out. Now he meets another character, another orphan, and the two of them kind of work together. And that relationship is important to the story, but it isn't that well developed. But it's touched on, and it gives our character some place to grow. This is also the shortest of all the books so far, and it just felt rushed. I would have liked a little more time in it, but for what it is, I had a good time because it brings you to the next story. So the next story takes place 6 months after the ending of the first one. The next one is Demon in Devil's Cavern. And in this one, we really see the relationship between Rory and the other main character who he met in the first one. We see that develop. We see more of an intimacy and a family relationship going on, of finding your place when it feels like everything else is taken away from you. Now, there's still a lot of splatter and gore and violence in this one. I will say it doesn't ever feel gratuitous. It doesn't feel edgelordy, but it is quite stark, and it is unapologetic in its violence and its depiction of violence, which I appreciate. It doesn't feel like it's going out of its way to push your buttons, but it does push some of them in the process. I think everything I was missing in the first novella, I found in this one. I think the world building was a lot better. It's still your kind of stereotypical frontier town, but you meet more characters and it has more depth to it, and it just feels more interesting. It feels more lived in. Our main character, we learn more about him and who he is as a person, as opposed to just being a vehicle for revenge, which is kind of what he was for the most part in the first one. So you learn more about him and how he exists outside of the trauma of losing his parents and losing other things in his life, and how he sees a future for himself, or how he sees himself existing outside of what he's experienced in the past, how he sees himself as creating something in the future with those he cares about. So I really appreciated that. I thought the character growth and the world building were all better in this one, and they gave me what I was missing in the first one. And again, with the violence and gore and the action, there is supernatural elements that are different than the first one, and they creep in from the outside. They never overtake the story, and I appreciate that. I like that it feels grounded. It feels like a realistic story, and then just these creepy supernatural elements come in from the outside. So they don't overwhelm the story, but they definitely set it apart, right? And I think that is a really wonderful way to handle them. Our main character doesn't have any supernatural powers. He isn't special in any way. So he is facing something that is outside of his league of understanding and of what he is built for, basically. So he's pushing himself, but he's doing it not just for himself, but for those he cares about. And so he is compelled in that way. And so these first two books I enjoyed a lot. I thought they did a good job when combined especially, of developing a character and of having really fun action set pieces and a really good exploration of what it means to be on your own, to have everything stripped away from you, and then to try to find um, community or family again, and then protect that once you find it. So not uncommon themes, right? None of this is unexpected in the genre, but I thought it was done really well, and I had a fun time reading both of them. Now, the third book, Where the Daybreak Ends, stories from Buzzard's Edge. So Buzzard's Edge is the name of the town that they live in. This I thought was genius. This is a collection of short stories that are basically telling an oral history of Buzzard's Edge. So the framing story of it is you meet a man walking in the desert and he comes across two storytellers, let's say, and they start telling him stories one after another. And the stories are telling the story of Buzzard's Edge, but stories that haven't happened yet. So in this kind of plane of existence where he finds himself with these storytellers, they're telling him stories of the past and stories of the future, and stories that have yet to happen but will happen. And the way it's framed, I think, is great. That framing device is really smart. I actually appreciate it quite a lot. And then within the framing device, all the individual stories I also thought were a lot of fun. Like every one was a good story. I thought they had a lot of them had characters that we'd already met in the previous stories, but there were also a whole handful of new characters. And now I think some of them could have been, padded out a little more. I wouldn't have minded with a little more character development. Maybe an extra page or two on some of those stories I thought would have gone a long way. But even with what we got, just as individual short stories, I had fun with each of them. But when you put them together, I think what they really do is they do a great job of world building. You give a huge 360-degree perspective of this town, and it kind of contextualizes so much of what you read in the first two novellas. So when all these individual stories, as well as their framing device, are combined, you get a really beautiful set of world building. I think it was a really smart way to kind of build up this world. And I know the author is writing another book in this series, and I think this sets like such a really wonderful ground to continue growing this world. I think the individual stories, some of them are quite touching. Overall, it's a much tamer collection than the first two. The violence and the kind of splatter isn't as graphic and isn't as overwhelming. There are still a number of supernatural elements, some of them quite nefarious, but the stories themselves actually are quite tender. There is a love story. There's really good queer representation, considering that the time and the place. I thought it was good queer representation. And what I really feel reading it is that there's just a lot of thought that has gone into this world and into all these different puzzle pieces that make this world something bigger than itself. And I really enjoyed that. I think also I read all three of these back to back because they're all quite short. You can read the first one in a single sitting, the second one in maybe two sittings, and this third one in, again, two sittings if you want. They're all very short novellas. And what was very clear is that the author became much more confident in this world as he kept writing. And he even says that the impetus for writing the first one was he wanted to write a Western. He hadn't written a Western before. So that was him kind of getting his feet wet in this genre, right, of horror Western. And you can tell that he has just become more confident with his character and more confident with the world he's built and what it means to live in that world. And so that is fun to read, right? It makes the stories and the books themselves more pleasurable, and it made me look forward a lot to the next book that he's currently writing in this same world. There are even some parts of this collection of short stories that are way more literary or stylized than they had any right to be. And now I'm not saying that there's any like highfalutin language. It's definitely not literary fiction, but there are just some passages that are really beautifully written that don't have to be, that could have been, much more short, sweet, and to the point. But there's a level of reflection and of character interiority in this book and these short stories that is really, really exciting. And it bodes well for wherever the author wants to go with this world, because his confidence in his writing and his blend of really straightforward action set pieces, as well as leaning into a little bit of sentimentality with a little bit of a literary flourish or a stylized flourish when he feels it'll accent what's going on. I think that combination, that balance, he is getting much more fluid with it, much more competent with it, at least looking at these three stories. And so it excites me to see what comes next, because I really did enjoy every story in this collection, and I enjoy the overall story of our main character, Rory, and where he's going and where he's left at the end of the second book. So I'm invested. I think that he did a good job of pulling me into the story enough that I actually care about the character. Like I said, if I had just read the first novella, I felt it was lacking a little bit. It was fun to read. It had great action set pieces, and the violence and gore was, continuous and really, really well done. But it lacked a little bit of something for me. It had heart, but it didn't have everything you needed to pull me in. I think it was too rushed. The second one was longer and it was building off the first one, and I thought it did it really, really well. Everything improved in the second one. And I really appreciated the first book when I read it in conjunction with the second one. If I had only read the first book, I would have been a little disappointed. But reading the first two together really worked for me. And then this one really just created a much bigger world, and it made me more excited to see what's going on in the future. Now, one thing I do have to say is if you look at the covers of these books, they are really cool looking, right? They're really, really beautiful. But at least for me, they don't fit the stories very well. I look at these covers and they seem almost like they are the covers of middle grade books. The animation style of these covers does not lead me to bloody, gory horror western that is a kind of adult content. And so the covers are a little misleading. I think they look nice, and I think the stylization of them is cool, just not necessarily the same tone as the stories themselves. So if you're looking at the covers and you feel like it may not be up your alley because it's a little too soft for you, and the covers read a lot younger than the stories themselves are. So I do have to say that going out. Other than that, I don't really have a lot to critique. These short stories are fun. The world building is really well developed after this whole collection of short stories. I think there's still more character growth that can happen, and I hope in the third story we get a little more character growth, and I hope we find some more ancillary characters that have more going on than just how they relate to our main character, because the ancillary characters we do get in the second one, they have their own lives going on, but we only kind of touch upon them very briefly. They are fulfilling a role for our main character only. So I hope we get a little bit more expansion in that way, and I think we will, insofar as that I see growth across both character and story across these three novels or novellas. That leads me to believe that the future ones will only continue in that same trend. So I'm excited for that. And in general, I would say, while this isn't revolutionary, the story isn't something you haven't heard before, even though the supernatural elements are fun and different than maybe what you'd expect. It isn't a story that is going to really take you by surprise, but what it is a very comfortable horror western that fits into the genre well, that is satisfying to read, and it kind of checks off all the right boxes, and just giving you enough intrigue and interest to be something special in and of itself. Even if it doesn't totally reinvent the wheel, it gives you enough excitement to keep you invested and to pull you along. So I had a lot of fun with all three of these stories. I highly recommend all of them if you like westerns and horror westerns, and if a little bit of splatter is up your alley. I think you'll have a good time with these. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Have you had a chance to read any of these or of any of the other books that Brennan LaFaro has written? He's written other books in the kind of splatter genre. This is his first foray into westerns, but he has written other horror novels and novellas before. So I'd love to hear any of your thoughts or your opinions down in the comments. For now, thank you for spending some time with me today. I appreciate you. Be kind to yourselves, take care of each other, and go slowly.